The camera flash exploded in Lucas's face like a small sun, and he smiled with that confidence he had built over 15 years at the helm of Crawford Enterprises. His hand rested on the waist of Larissa Montero, whose blood-red dress seemed to have been painted directly onto her slender body. The model leaned into him, her lips brushing his ear as she whispered something provocative that made his heart race. The photographers went wild, shouting their names, begging for another angle, another pose. Lucas felt invincible. The Grand Meridian Hotel in Boston had never witnessed an event as prestigious as the East Coast Business Award. Executives, magnates, and celebrities converged on that red carpet as if it were the final runway to corporate Olympus. Lucas had planned every detail of that night for months. Not just his presence, but his statement. He was tired of hiding, tired of pretending that his marriage to Daniela still meant anything beyond a convenient social contract. Larissa squeezed his hand, and he looked at her, admiring how the spotlights danced on her perfectly coiffed brown hair. 28 years old, cover of 3 international magazines in the last quarter, and completely devoted to him. At least, that's what Lucas believed. She represented everything Daniela no longer was. Young, stunning, exciting. Daniela had become predictable, immersed in her social causes and endless board meetings. When was the last time she made him feel alive like this? A reporter from the Boston Business Review thrust a microphone towards Lucas, his eyes gleaming with a hunger for an explosive headline. "Mr. Crawford, you're here with Larissa Montero. Where is your wife tonight?" Lucas didn't even hesitate. He had rehearsed that answer a dozen times in his office mirror. "Daniela is at home, tending to personal matters. Larissa was kind enough to accompany me as my special guest." The lie slipped from his tongue with disturbing ease. Daniela was at home because he had told her the event was boring, full of empty corporate speeches, not worth her time. She had believed him, as she always did. 15 years of marriage had built that blind trust, and Lucas was about to shatter it on national television. Larissa laughed, a melodious sound that echoed through the cameras. She pressed against him, and Lucas caught the scent of the expensive perfume he had bought for her that morning, an exclusive fragrance from a Parisian boutique. $4,000 in a glass bottle. Daniela would have considered that an obscene waste. As they walked the carpet, Lucas allowed himself to imagine Daniela's reaction when she saw the photos tomorrow. Perhaps initial shock, followed by silent tears. She had always been restrained with her emotions, keeping everything to herself as if vulnerability were a weakness. Part of him felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it down. Suffocating it with justifications he had repeated so many times, they now sounded like absolute truths. He deserved to be happy. He deserved to feel desired. A murmur rippled through the crowd, undulating through the guests like a stone dropped into a quiet lake. Lucas noticed heads turning, photographers redirecting their lenses away from him. His first thought was irritation. What celebrity had arrived to steal his moment of glory? Then he saw her. Daniela Crawford emerged at the red carpet entrance like an apparition from another world. Her dress was a deep, nocturnal blue, covered in tiny crystals that caught the light hypnotically, making her look like a living constellation. Her dark hair was pulled back into an elegant chignon that exposed the graceful line of her neck, where a diamond necklace rested like drops of frozen light. But it wasn't the dress or the jewelry that made Lucas's stomach clench in a painful knot. It was the man beside her. Zachary Brennan, the actor who had dominated the box office for the past 3 years, walked with Daniela as if they were in a perfectly choreographed rehearsal. His hand rested lightly on the small of her back, protective, yet not possessive. He smiled at her, and Daniela reciprocated with an expression Lucas hadn't seen on her face in years, genuine, uninhibited joy. "Who is that?" Larissa whispered, her voice losing a bit of its former confidence. Lucas couldn't answer. His throat had constricted, words caught somewhere between disbelief and rising panic. This couldn't be happening. Daniela was at home. She was at home, wearing her flannel pajamas, probably reading one of those dry management books she always carried. But there she was, gliding down the red carpet with the grace of someone born for that moment. The photographers had become a storm of flashes, their shouts increasing in intensity. Reporters stumbled over each other, desperate to reach her first. Daniela Crawford, are you the surprise CEO of the event? Ms. Crawford, can you confirm the rumors about your role in the organization? Zachary, how did you two meet? Lucas felt Larissa stiffen beside him as Daniela's name echoed through the crowd. The realization hit them both simultaneously. The woman stealing all the attention, the woman making Lucas Crawford disappear into the shadows, was his wife. Daniela stopped at the center of the red carpet, exactly where Lucas and Larissa had posed moments before. She didn't look in his direction, gave no sign that she had noticed his presence. Instead, she turned to the cameras with a smile that was pure elegance and controlled power. Good evening. Her voice cut through the chaos like a sharp blade. It's a pleasure to be here as the executive director of the Boston Prosperity Initiative, the true organizer of this event. Lucas's world began to spin. Boston Prosperity Initiative. He had heard Daniela mention that name a few times in recent months, but had assumed it was just another one of her charitable causes, something to keep her busy while he built his empire. How could he have been so stupidly blind? Furthermore, Daniela continued, her voice gaining strength, I'd like to use this platform to make a personal announcement. Lucas felt every muscle in his body clench. No, not here. Not like this. I am officially declaring the end of my marriage to Lucas Crawford. The divorce papers were filed this morning. The silence that followed was more deafening than any explosion. Then, like a dam breaking, the reporters' shouts erupted into a frenzy. Cameras spun to find Lucas on the carpet, frozen in place, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. But Daniela wasn't finished. She raised her hand, asking for silence, and miraculously, the crowd obeyed. As part of my new journey, I will be donating half of the marital assets, which include significant stakes in Crawford Enterprises, to the Boston Children's Education and Homeless Shelters Foundation. I believe true wealth lies in using our resources to uplift those most in need. Lucas felt his knees buckle, half of his assets. She was giving half of everything he had built to charity. His company, his properties, his carefully cultivated investments, all crumbling in real-time, broadcast live to millions of viewers. Larissa released his hand, stepping back, as if his mere touch could contaminate her with his disaster. Lucas watched her assess the situation with the calculated precision of someone who always knew how to swim away from sinking ships. In seconds, she had vanished into the crowd, her red dress a fleeting blur. Daniela finally looked in his direction. Her eyes met his across the distance, and in them Lucas saw something that terrified him more than anger or hatred. He saw indifference. She had completely dismissed him, reducing him to a closed chapter, a story no longer worth telling. Zachary Brennan leaned in, whispering something into Daniela's ear that made her smile, a genuine smile that lit up her entire face. Lucas remained paralyzed on the red carpet as the crowd moved around him like water flowing around a stone. His bespoke Italian shoes seemed to have fused to the ground, making any movement impossible. He watched Daniela and Zachary Brennan disappear through the doors of the Grand Meridian, swallowed by a wave of executives and celebrities who surrounded them as if they were royalty. The contrast was brutal. Minutes ago, he was the center of attention, and now he was just an inconvenient obstacle in the path of guests eager to enter the event. A television producer rushed past him, shouting orders into his headset about last-minute broadcast changes. Lucas caught fragments of the conversation, words like "story of the year" and "explosive divorce" piercing his hazy consciousness. His phone vibrated incessantly in the inner pocket of his tuxedo, but he couldn't muster the strength to check it. It was probably Crawford Enterprises board members, panicked investors, or worse, his lawyer Richard Pemberton with news about the true extent of the financial damage Daniela had just inflicted. A security guard's hand landed gently on his shoulder, pulling him back to the present moment. "Sir, I need to ask you to move. Other guests are trying to enter." Lucas looked at the man, a middle-aged security guard with compassionate eyes who had probably witnessed countless human dramas in that position. There was pity in that gaze, and it burned more than any insult could have. Lucas Crawford didn't need pity. He was a titan of industry, an empire builder, a man who turned ideas into fortunes. Except now half of that fortune was being donated to charity by a woman he had catastrophically underestimated. He forced his legs to move, stumbling off the red carpet and towards the hotel's side entrance. There was no way he could enter through the main door now, not with the cameras still rolling and reporters hungry for a statement from him. His mind reeled, trying to formulate some narrative that could salvage his image, but every thought collided with the inescapable reality. Daniela had won, completely, publicly, devastatingly. The hotel's side corridor was a gallery of portraits of former presidents and magnates who had stayed at the Grand Meridian over the decades. Lucas walked past them without really seeing, their features blurred by unshed tears that burned behind his eyes. He never cried. Crying was weakness, and weakness was unacceptable in his world. But in that moment, alone in an empty corridor while the event of the century unfolded just meters away, Lucas felt something break inside him. His phone finally stopped vibrating, and in the sudden silence, he pulled it from his pocket with trembling hands. 53 missed calls, 32 text messages. The first was from Richard, sent 7 minutes after Daniela's announcement. "We need to talk immediately. Critical situation. Do not speak to the press." Lucas slid to the next message, this one from his oldest partner, Marcus Chen. "What the hell happened? The board is panicking. Shares are already down 12%. Call me." He kept scrolling, each message a reminder of how his life was unraveling in real time. But it was the last one that stopped him completely. It was from a number he didn't recognize, a simple, devastating text message. "Hope it was worth it. La Larissa." She hadn't even waited long enough to see how the night would end. The moment she realized he was sinking, she had jumped ship without a backward glance. Lucas let out a bitter laugh that echoed through the empty corridor. The woman for whom he had risked everything, for whom he had betrayed his wife and destroyed his marriage, had vanished at the first sign of trouble. And Daniela, the woman he had considered boring and predictable, had orchestrated the most elaborate and public revenge he could have imagined. How had he not seen this coming? His mind began to rewind the last few months, searching for signs he should have noticed. Daniela's trips to charity conferences that he had dismissed. The evening meetings she casually mentioned during dinner while he barely paid attention, more interested in texting Larissa under the table. The way she had stopped asking questions about his day, about his work, about his increasingly frequent nights out. He had interpreted all of this as disinterest, as evidence that their marriage had naturally cooled. But it wasn't disinterest. It was strategy. Daniela had used his own contempt against him, transforming his arrogance into a perfectly constructed trap, and he had walked right into it, smiling and posing for the cameras. A group of guests walked past him in the corridor, their animated conversations a mix of speculation about the red carpet drama. Lucas caught fragments as they passed. Always thought they were the perfect couple. "Did you see her dress? Absolutely stunning. Zachary Brennan. Can you believe it? She definitely upgraded." The words pierced his consciousness like small, sharp arrows. Daniela had upgraded. That was the narrative forming, the story that would be told in the coming days and weeks. She wasn't the betrayed, humiliated wife. She was the hero who had broken free from an unfaithful husband, donating her wealth to noble causes while appearing on the arm of one of the most desired men in the world. And Lucas? He was the villain, the fool, the man who had traded gold for trinkets. Lucas finally found an empty restroom and locked himself in one of the stalls. He sat on the toilet lid, his head in his hands, trying to breathe through the tightness in his chest. His $5,000 tuxedo suddenly felt like it was suffocating him, the fabric too fine to provide any real comfort. He loosened his bow tie, letting it hang around his neck like a loose rope. How long had he spent building Crawford Enterprises? 15 years of relentless work, brutal negotiations, sacrifices he had justified as necessary for success. He had lost friendships, lost time with family, lost parts of himself in the process. And for what? To watch half of it all be donated in a single public announcement? But it wasn't just about the money, Lucas realized with sudden, painful clarity. It was about control. He had built his entire life around the illusion that he was in charge, that he made the decisions, that he dictated the terms. Daniela had shattered that illusion with a surgeon's precision, revealing that he had never had as much control as he thought. His phone vibrated again, this time with a call from Richard. Lucas answered, his voice coming out weaker than he intended. Richard. Lucas, thank God. Where are you? I need you to come to my office immediately. We have a serious situation. I know we have a serious situation, Richard. I was there. I saw it. No, you don't understand. The lawyer's voice was tight in a way Lucas had never heard before. Richard Pemberton had represented some of Boston's nastiest divorces, always maintaining an unwavering professional calm. To hear him sound genuinely alarmed made Lucas's stomach churn. The papers Daniela filed this morning. She has documentation of everything. Every dinner with Larissa, every gift you bought, every trip you took together. She has financial records, text messages, photographs. Lucas, she's been building a case for months, maybe longer. How did she? I don't know how she got all this, but she did. And with today's public announcement about the asset donation, she's positioning herself as the morally superior party. Any attempt by us to contest the division of assets will just make us look even more, well, bad. So what are you saying? Richard paused, and in that silence, Lucas heard his sentence before the words were spoken. I'm saying you need to accept her terms. Fighting will only drag this out publicly, and with the evidence she has, you'll lose anyway. And the damage to Crawford Enterprises will be irreparable. Lucas hung up without saying goodbye, his phone slipping from his hand and clattering onto the tiled floor with a sharp crack. He looked at the cracked screen, thinking how it was a perfect metaphor for his life in that moment. Something that seemed solid and invulnerable, shattered in a single impact. Tears finally came, silent and bitter, sliding down his face as he sat alone in a hotel restroom during what should have been his night of triumph. In the ballroom, just meters away, Daniela was likely glowing, accepting congratulations, posing for more photographs with Zachary Brennan by her side. And Lucas was here, hidden like a shamed child, facing the ruins of everything he thought he knew about his life and himself. The fluorescent light of the restroom buzzed softly, a monotonous hum that filled the silence as Lucas remained seated, staring blankly at his cracked phone on the floor. How much time had passed since he had locked himself in? 10 minutes? 20? Time had lost its meaning, merging into a blur of regret and disbelief. He knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. But the alternative of facing that crowd, those looks of pity and judgment, seemed impossible to bear. A soft knock on the main restroom door made him lift his head. Lucas? I know you're in there. The voice was Marcus Chen's, his oldest partner, and until recently, his closest friend. Lucas hesitated, considering remaining silent, but knew Marcus wouldn't give up easily. With a heavy sigh, he stood up, picked up his broken phone, and unlocked the stall door. Marcus stood by the sink, his arms crossed over his chest. At 42, he maintained the same impeccable posture Lucas had always admired, his gray suit without a single wrinkle, despite the chaotic night. But there was something in his eyes, a palpable disappointment that cut Lucas deeper than any words could have. Were you planning on telling me about Larissa? Marcus asked, his voice carefully controlled. Or was I destined to find out along with the rest of the world? Lucas turned on the faucet, letting cold water run over his hands. He needed something tangible to focus on, something other than Marcus's accusing gaze reflected in the mirror. It wasn't planned, Lucas murmured, knowing how pathetic the excuse sounded. It just happened. Nothing just happens, Lucas. Marcus stepped closer, his voice gaining a restrained intensity. You made choices. You chose to betray Daniela. You chose to bring your mistress to the most important event of the year. You chose to publicly humiliate your wife. Except I'm the one who ended up humiliated, Lucas replied, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. He turned off the water and faced Marcus directly. Daniela orchestrated all of this. She knew what I would do, and she used it against me. And you're surprised? Marcus shook his head, an expression of disbelief crossing his face. Daniela has always been 10 steps ahead of all of us. Did you really think she would simply accept your betrayal without reacting? Lucas had no answer for that. He had, in fact, assumed exactly that. Daniela had always been understanding, forgiving, willing to prioritize harmony over confrontation. But this Daniela on the red carpet, radiant and powerful, declaring her divorce with unwavering confidence, was someone he clearly had never truly known. Crawford Enterprises shares dropped 17%, Marcus continued, each word a calculated blow. 17% in less than an hour. We have shareholders demanding an emergency meeting. The board is considering a vote of no confidence. And all of this because you couldn't keep your personal life private. This isn't fair, Lucas protested, feeling a wave of anger surge through his stupor. Daniela was the one who made it public. She was the one who made that dramatic announcement. After you paraded your mistress on the red carpet, Marcus's voice finally broke his professional calm, echoing against the tiled walls. What did you expect? That she would stay home, crying silently while you destroyed 15 years of marriage on national television? The silence that followed was dense and suffocating. Lucas saw something change in Marcus's eyes, a decision being made in real time. I received an offer from Daniela this afternoon, Marcus said finally, his voice returning to a neutral, professional tone. She's forming a new investment consortium focused on socially responsible companies. She wants me to be her lead partner. Lucas felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. You can't be seriously considering that. Why not? Daniela has always had a keen business sense. She simply chose to focus on social impact instead of pure profit. But now, with the assets she's receiving from the divorce, she has capital and credibility. And unlike you, she hasn't publicly destroyed her reputation. We built Crawford Enterprises together, Lucas said, hating the desperate tone that crept into his voice. You and I, Marcus. 15 years of partnership. And you threw it all away for a 28-year-old model. Marcus moved towards the door, stopping only to look back one last time. I haven't made my decision about Daniela's offer yet. But you need to understand something, Lucas. Actions have consequences, and yours are only just beginning to unfold. The door closed behind Marcus with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the quietness of the restroom. Lucas was alone again, but now the isolation felt different, more permanent. He had assumed that his position in the company, his connections, his shared history with people like Marcus, would shield him from the consequences of his personal choices. Another shattered illusion. He knew he couldn't put off the inevitable any longer. With legs that felt made of lead, Lucas exited the restroom and headed towards the main ballroom. The sounds of celebration hit him even before he reached the double doors, laughter and music blending into a cacophony of joy, of which he was no longer a part. A young hotel employee was positioned at the entrance, checking invitations. His eyes widened when he recognized Lucas, and he quickly averted his gaze, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Crawford," he murmured, stepping aside to let him pass without asking for his invitation. Even the hotel staff treated him with the caution reserved for social pariahs. The ballroom was a marvel of modern elegance, with crystal chandeliers hanging from a 20-foot-high ceiling, casting dancing light patterns over the hundreds of assembled guests. Round tables with pristine white linen tablecloths surrounded a central dance floor where a few couples were already moving to the sound of a live jazz band. The main stage at the back of the room was decorated with the logo of the Boston Prosperity Initiative, a symbol Lucas now recognized but had completely ignored when Daniela had mentioned it months ago. He found her instantly, as if his eyes were magnetically drawn to her. Daniela was near the stage, surrounded by a group of prominent executives and philanthropists who hung on her every word. Zachary Brennan was still by her side, though now maintaining a more respectful distance, suggesting that perhaps his role was more strategic than romantic. Daniela gesticulated animatedly as she spoke, her face alight with a passion Lucas rarely saw at home, and he realized with a painful clench in his chest that she was finally in her element. "I never thought I'd see Lucas Crawford entering through the back door." The voice came from his left, laden with thinly disguised amusement. Lucas turned to find Veronica Ashford, editor-in-chief of Boston Elite magazine, holding a champagne flute with the casualness of someone who watched human dramas as a professional sport. "Veronica," Lucas greeted, his voice coming out tenser than he intended. "I must say, this is the most exciting event I've covered in years." She took a sip of her champagne, her eyes gleaming with predatory journalistic interest. The betrayed wife revealing herself as the true force behind the event, while the unfaithful husband watches with his mistress. It's Shakespearean. "I didn't come here to be gossip column fodder," Lucas replied, trying to get past her. "Oh, but you already are, dear." Veronica blocked his path with a sharp smile. "In fact, you became the story of the year the moment you stepped onto that red carpet. But here's something you might not know yet." Lucas hesitated, part of him wanting to pull away, but a morbid curiosity kept him in place. "Daniela wasn't just planning this event for months," Veronica continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "She was the main seed investor. She practically created the Boston Prosperity Initiative from scratch, using a network of funds she had been cultivating for years. All that charity work you thought was just a hobby? She was building a parallel empire while you were distracted." The words hit Lucas like physical blows. Daniela hadn't just reacted to his betrayal. She had been preparing to leave him long before he made the decision to appear publicly with Larissa. His entire life with her, everything he thought he knew, was a carefully maintained facade while she built her exit. "How many people know this?" Lucas asked, his throat dry. "Everyone who matters." Veronica gestured vaguely to the room. "Boston high society has been talking about Daniela's project for semesters. You were literally the last to know. Quite ironic, isn't it? The husband who thought he was in control was the only one completely in the dark." Lucas didn't wait to hear more. He pulled away from Veronica, navigating through the crowd with the sole objective of reaching Daniela. He needed to talk to her, needed to understand how everything had come to this point. But with every step he took towards her, more people seemed to materialize in his path, their faces a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. "Lucas, what a surprise to see you here," said Jonathan Wright, CEO of a rival investment firm, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Tough night, I imagine?" "Not now, Jonathan. It's just that I'm curious," Jonathan continued, ignoring Lucas's attempt to pass. "How did you not know about your own wife's involvement in this event? I mean, she's literally the main organizer." Others gathered around, drawn by the promise of confrontation like sharks to the smell of blood. Lucas recognized several of them. Competitors, acquaintances, people he had negotiated with over the years. All of them looked at him now with a mix of pity and thinly veiled satisfaction. No one reached Lucas's level of success without making enemies, and now those enemies were savoring his public downfall. "My personal life is none of your business," Lucas said, his voice coming out weaker than he intended. "It became everyone's business when you decided to make it public," a gray-haired woman retorted. Lucas vaguely recognized her as a member of some philanthropic board Daniela frequented. "Daniela is one of ours. We look after our own." The message was clear. He had crossed a line by publicly humiliating Daniela, and now her entire network of influence was closing in on him. As Lucas struggled to formulate a response, a movement on the stage drew everyone's attention. The lights in the hall dimmed, and a spotlight illuminated Daniela as she approached the microphone. "Good evening, everyone." Her voice echoed through the room, instantly commanding absolute silence. "Thank you for attending the first annual Boston Prosperity Initiative Gala. Tonight is not just about celebrating business success, but about redefining what true success means in our community." Lucas froze in the middle of the crowd, forced to watch as Daniela articulated a vision of corporate leadership with social responsibility that was simultaneously inspiring and an implicit condemnation of everything he represented. She spoke of using resources to uplift communities, of measuring success not just in profits, but in improved lives, of building legacies that mattered beyond financial balance sheets. And then, inevitably, her eyes found his across the crowded room. For a moment, just a heartbeat, Lucas saw something flash across her face. It wasn't anger or triumph, but something more complex. Perhaps even a shadow of sadness for what they had lost. But then it vanished, replaced by the mask of polished professionalism she wore for the public. Daniela didn't mention him again, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. She simply continued her speech, announcing the night's honorees and the projects the initiative would support in the coming year. Lucas realized this was worse than any direct confrontation could have been. She had completely erased him from her narrative, rendered him irrelevant in her own story. When the applause finally erupted, Lucas found himself unable to join in. His hands remained at his sides while everyone around him celebrated the woman he had betrayed, the woman who now shone more brightly than he had ever allowed her to shine beside him. The Grand Meridian Hotel had transformed into a cruel stage of inversions. Lucas watched from the perimeter of the ballroom as Daniela circulated through the crowd, with the grace of a queen, stopping at each table to converse, gently touch arms, laugh that genuine laugh he hadn't seen in years. Every interaction was a display of social power he had never known she possessed. Or perhaps she had always possessed it, and he had simply never paid enough attention to notice. Zachary Brennan remained close by, but Lucas was beginning to understand his true function. He wasn't a lover, Lucas realized with bitter clarity. He was a shield, a visual symbol that Daniela had not only survived Lucas's betrayal, but thrived beyond it. The actor was famous enough to guarantee media attention, charming enough to make any romantic interest believable, but there was something rehearsed about their interactions. They were partners in a performance, not lovers in a relationship. Somehow, that hurt even more. "You look like a man on the verge of a nervous breakdown." Lucas turned to find Helen Zhao, a corporate lawyer who had collaborated with Crawford Enterprises on several acquisitions over the years. She held 2 champagne flutes, offering one to him with a smile that carried more sympathy than he deserved. "I don't feel like drinking," Lucas mumbled, but accepted the glass anyway. His hands needed something to hold before they started to visibly tremble. "Daniela hired me 6 months ago," Helen said casually, taking a sip of her champagne. "She wanted to ensure all the divorce documents were absolutely flawless. Every asset tracked, every transaction documented, every law followed to the letter." Lucas felt his stomach churn. "You worked for me." "I worked for your company, Lucas. There's a difference." Helen glanced across the room to where Daniela was conversing with a group of investors. "And when Daniela approached me with evidence of what you were doing, of the company money you were using to impress Larissa, well, my loyalty to legal integrity outweighed any personal loyalty." "Company money," Lucas repeated, confusion momentarily replacing his misery. "I never used corporate funds for..." "The corporate credit card you used to buy that diamond necklace for Larissa in March? The lavish restaurant dinners charged as business expenses when you were the only ones present? The hotel suite in New York you booked through the company travel account?" Helen enumerated each item with clinical precision. "Daniela has a record of everything. And as a silent majority shareholder of Crawford Enterprises, something you apparently forgot when you married under community property laws, she had every right to audit those transactions." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Lucas's feet. Daniela isn't a majority shareholder. I founded the company. I built everything. With her initial trust fund investment, Helen corrected gently, $2.5 million her father left her, which she invested in your dream when you got married. Do you remember that, Lucas? Or have those early years when she believed in you unconditionally gotten lost somewhere along the way? Memories Lucas had buried under layers of justification and self-importance began to resurface. Daniela, sitting in their tiny apartment, reviewing business plans late into the night. Daniela calling every contact her father had left her, opening doors that would have remained closed to an unknown entrepreneur. Daniela relinquishing her own professional ambitions to become the invisible support that allowed Lucas to shine. "I'm going to give you some unsolicited advice," Helen said, her voice softening slightly. "Accept the terms Daniela is offering. You'll still walk away with considerable wealth, more than most people see in a lifetime. But if you fight it, if you try to drag this through the mud, she has enough ammunition to completely destroy you. And unlike you, she's not afraid to use it." Helen walked away, leaving Lucas alone again with thoughts that spun like debris in a whirlpool. How much of his life was built on foundations he didn't even recognize? How many of his accomplishments were truly his? And how many were made possible by a woman whose contributions he had systematically minimized and forgotten? Dinner was served, and Lucas found himself seated at a table at the back of the ballroom, surrounded by unfamiliar faces who clearly knew exactly who he was. The conversation at the table died whenever he tried to participate, only resurrecting when he retreated into silence. He prodded the food on his plate, a perfectly cooked filet mignon that tasted like sawdust in his mouth. On stage, Daniela announced the night's honorees. There was an educator who had transformed a failing school district, a nurse who had founded a mobile clinic for the homeless, a young entrepreneur who had created a tech company dedicated to clean energy solutions for underserved communities. Each story was presented with a moving video. Each honoree received a standing ovation. Lucas recognized the common theme. All these people had used their resources and talents to uplift others. They had measured success not in personal accumulation, but in community impact. It was all an implicit condemnation of everything Lucas represented, everything he had built his identity around. When dinner ended and the music started again, Lucas saw his opportunity. Daniela had moved away from her group, heading towards what appeared to be a corridor leading backstage. He followed her, his heart pounding with a mixture of desperation and determination. "Daniela." She stopped, her back still to him. For a moment, Lucas thought she would simply keep walking, ignoring him completely. But then she turned, and the look she gave him was more of weariness than anger. "What do you want, Lucas?" "I need to understand." The words tumbled out, unfiltered. "How did we get here? When did you decide this is what you wanted?" Daniela let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Do you really have to ask? Do you think I didn't know about Larissa? About the dinners, the trips, the increasingly elaborate lies? If you knew, why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was busy building my exit." Daniela crossed her arms, her body language defensive but her face maintaining that unflappable calm. "At first, when I first suspected a year ago, I thought about confronting you. I thought maybe we could work through it, go to couples therapy, find our way back to each other." "Then why didn't we?" "Because I paid attention to how you looked at me, Lucas. Or rather, how you didn't look. I had become invisible to you, a domestic convenience who managed your home and attended events when necessary. And I realized I didn't want to be invisible anymore. I wanted to build something that was mine, something that mattered." Lucas took a step towards her, but she raised a hand, stopping him. "The Boston Prosperity Initiative began as a fantasy," Daniela continued, "a way to imagine myself in a different life. But the more I worked on it, the more real it became. I rediscovered parts of myself I had buried when we married. The woman who cared about more than financial balance sheets. The woman who believed that wealth came with responsibility. I could have supported that," Lucas said, knowing how hollow it sounded. "You could have told me." Would you have truly listened? Or would you have patted me on the head and gone back to your important business? Daniela shook her head. I needed to do this on my own, Lucas. I needed to prove to myself that I was capable. And along the way, I built a network of people who truly saw me, who valued my ideas and my vision. And Zachary Brennan? Is he part of that network? A genuine smile crossed Daniela's face for the first time since they began talking. Zachary is a friend who understood what I was trying to do tonight. He offered to accompany me because he knew his presence would guarantee media coverage. There's nothing romantic between us, if that's what you're asking. But honestly, even if there were, it would no longer be any of your business. The words cut deeper than Lucas expected. He had no right to feel jealous, no right to any claim over Daniela's life anymore. But knowing that intellectually didn't stop the sharp ache in his chest. Half the assets, Lucas said, shifting to safer, more transactional territory. You don't have to give it all to charity. We could reach a different agreement. I don't want a different agreement. Daniela's voice was firm. That money will do real good in the world, Lucas. It will educate children, shelter families, create opportunities for people who never had any. That means more to me than any amount of personal wealth could. And me? Lucas asked, hating the vulnerability in his own voice. What happens to me? Daniela studied his face for a long moment, and Lucas saw complex emotions flit across her features. Anger, sadness, perhaps even a remnant of the love they once shared. But when she finally spoke, her voice was resolute. You survive, Lucas. You still have your company, your connections, more than enough money to live comfortably. What you no longer have is a wife you can take for granted. And honestly, I think that's the best thing that could happen to you. How can you say that? Because maybe now you'll have to truly look at who you've become. Maybe you'll have to question if the man who builds empires on top of broken relationships is really who you want to be. Daniela started to walk away, then paused, looking over her shoulder. I truly hope you find some happiness, Lucas. But it won't be with me, and it won't be with women like Larissa, who only want what your money can buy. It will have to come from within, and that's a job only you can do. Lucas watched her disappear down the corridor, the sound of her heels echoing until it was lost in the distant music from the ballroom. He stood alone in the empty hallway, surrounded by portraits of important men who had stayed in that hotel over the decades. All of them looked down with their stern, confident expressions, reminders of a type of masculinity and success Lucas had aspired to his whole life. But looking at those faces now, Lucas wondered how many of them had sacrificed meaningful relationships on the altar of ambition. How many had died alone in hotel rooms, surrounded by accomplishments but not by love? How many had realized too late that wealth without connection was just a gilded cage? His phone vibrated, breaking his spiral of thoughts. It was a message from Larissa, finally responding to the 36 calls and texts he had sent since she had disappeared from the red carpet. It was fun while it lasted. You understand, right? I can't be associated with this kind of publicity. Take care. Lucas stared at the message for a long time, expecting to feel anger or betrayal. But all that came was a distant numbness, a resigned acceptance that Larissa had never been what he thought she was. She was a mirror that reflected back only what he wanted to see. Never a real person with depth and complexity. Not like Daniela. The thought came unbidden, bringing with it a wave of regret so intense that Lucas had to lean against the wall. He had had something real, something built over 15 years of shared history, and he had thrown it away for a fantasy. And now he was alone in a hotel corridor, watching the wreckage of his life scattered around him like pieces of a puzzle he had no idea how to reassemble. Lucas didn't go back to the ballroom. Instead, he found himself wandering through the luxurious corridors of the Grand Meridian, past empty conference rooms and silent lounges, where the celebration inside was just a distant murmur. His steps eventually led him to an outdoor terrace on the 10th floor, a private space usually reserved for VIP suites. But it was empty on that still cold March night in Boston. The chilly air hit his lungs like a much-needed slap, bringing a painful clarity he had been avoiding. The city stretched out before him, millions of lights blinking in the darkness like promises of lives being lived, choices being made, consequences being faced. Somewhere down there, people were having dinner with their families, laughing with genuine friends, building relationships based on something more substantial than convenience and appearances. When was the last time he had done something like that? His phone continued to vibrate intermittently, but Lucas finally silenced it completely. There was no message that could change his current situation, no call that could undo the choices that had led him to this moment. He was alone with his thoughts for the first time in months, perhaps years, and the experience was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. The terrace door opened behind him, and Lucas turned, expecting a security guard to ask him to leave. Instead, Marcus Chen emerged, still impeccable in his gray suit, carrying 2 bottles of beer. "I thought you could use one of these," Marcus said, offering one of the bottles. "The champagne in there is a bit too refined for the kind of night you're having." Lucas accepted the beer without a word, surprised by the gesture. After their earlier conversation in the restroom, he had presumed Marcus had completely abandoned him. They drank in silence for a few minutes, the March chill biting through their thin tuxedos. "I'm not taking Daniela's offer," Marcus finally said, looking at the skyline instead of at Lucas. "Not immediately, at least. I'm going to give you a chance to fix the mess you've made at Crawford Enterprises before I make any decisions." Lucas felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he was holding. "Why? I destroyed everything we built. You don't owe me anything." "No, I don't. But we built something together that's worth saving, even if you temporarily forgot that." Marcus finally turned to face him, his eyes serious but not without compassion. "You messed up, Lucas. You messed up spectacularly and publicly. But I knew you before all this success went to your head. I knew the man who worked 80 hours a week not just out of greed, but because he genuinely believed he was building something important. That man feels very distant now. Then find your way back to him." Marcus took a long swig of his beer. "But you need to understand something. This is going to require real work, Lucas. Not just professional work, but personal work. You're going to need to honestly look at who you've become and decide if that's who you want to be." The words echoed what Daniela had said, and Lucas realized that perhaps this was the common theme he needed to finally confront. Everyone around him could see what he refused to admit to himself. He had lost his way somewhere between building an empire and becoming a person he no longer even recognized. "How do I do that?" Lucas asked, hating how lost he sounded. "How do I begin to fix this?" "Honestly, I don't know." Marcus finished his beer, setting the empty bottle on a nearby table. "But I know it starts with stopping the running, stopping the hiding. You need to go back in there, face the reality of what you've done, and start living with the consequences. Everyone hates me in there. No, not everyone hates you. Some despise you, others pity you, and some are probably just relieved it's not them in your shoes. But if you stay out here on the terrace, hiding in the dark, you're confirming everything they think about you, that you're a coward who only knows how to act confident when you're on top." The truth in Marcus's words cut deep, but Lucas knew he was right. Hiding wouldn't change anything. Running away would only prolong the agony. If he was going to have any chance of rebuilding his life, of discovering who he really was beneath all the layers of arrogance and self-deception, he needed to start by facing the humiliation he had created for himself. "Will you come in with me?" Lucas asked, the vulnerability in his voice something he would never have allowed Marcus to hear before that night. "Yes," Marcus replied simply. "But you'll walk in with your own head held high. No hiding behind me or anyone else." They walked back into the ballroom together, and Lucas forced himself to walk upright, to meet the eyes of people passing him instead of looking away. It was one of the hardest things he had ever done, each gaze feeling like a physical judgment. But he kept walking, kept breathing, kept existing in the space that had become profoundly uncomfortable. The night proceeded around him in a surreal haze. Lucas found an empty table near the back and simply watched. He watched Daniela dance with Zachary Brennan, their movements graceful and confident. He watched groups of people he thought he knew laugh and connect in ways that seemed genuine. He watched couples who clearly still cared for each other, whose gazes still carried sparks of something real and unperformative. At some point during the night, a woman approached his table. She was older, perhaps in her early 60s, with elegantly styled silver hair and eyes that carried the kind of wisdom that came from lived experience rather than inherited privilege. "You're Lucas Crawford," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Yes," Lucas confirmed, steeling himself for another confrontation or judgment. "I'm Margaret Lawson. I met Daniela through our joint work at women's shelters." She pulled up a chair without waiting for an invitation, sitting down with the authority of someone accustomed to taking up space. "I didn't come here to make you feel worse than you obviously already are, but I came to tell you something I think you need to hear." Lucas waited, unsure what to expect. "Daniela cried in my office 3 months ago," Margaret continued. "She cried because she still loved you, despite everything. She cried because the woman she wanted to be, the woman she was building through the Boston Prosperity Initiative, was not compatible with being married to a man who made her invisible." The words hit Lucas like physical blows. "She told you about Larissa?" "She told me everything. And do you know what she said when I asked her why she didn't just confront you?" Margaret leaned forward, her eyes never leaving Lucas's face. "She said she was afraid you would choose Larissa, that she couldn't bear to hear you say you would choose her over Daniela. So she prepared to leave you first, before you could leave her." Lucas felt tears burn behind his eyes for the second time that night. "I never would have chosen Larissa over her." "But you did choose her, didn't you?" Margaret's voice was gentle, but firm. "You may not have said the words, but your actions spoke for you. Every dinner with Larissa, every expensive gift, every lie you told. Those were all choices, Lucas, and Daniela heard every one of them loud and clear. So why are you telling me this? To make me feel worse? No, I'm telling you this because you need to understand what you truly lost. You didn't just lose a wife or a business partner. You lost a woman who loved you enough to cry for you even when you were betraying her. A woman who built her exit with dignity instead of cruel revenge, even though she had every right to revenge." Margaret stood up, preparing to leave. "What you do with this information is up to you, but if you truly want to grow from this, start by honoring what you lost instead of minimizing it." Lucas watched Margaret walk away, her words echoing in his mind. Daniela had cried for him. Despite everything, despite his betrayal and neglect, she had cried. That should have made him feel better, should have offered some kind of solace. Instead, it made everything infinitely worse because it meant he hadn't just destroyed something convenient or comfortable. He had destroyed something precious, something real, something most people spent lifetimes searching for and never found. The night eventually began to wind down, guests starting to leave in small groups. Lucas remained at his table, watching the ballroom slowly empty. He saw Daniela bid farewell to her guests at the entrance, warmly embracing people, accepting congratulations on the event's success. Zachary Brennan had left at some point, his role in the evening's performance complete. Finally, when only the cleaning crew remained, arranging tables and collecting decorations, Lucas forced himself to stand. His legs were stiff from sitting so long, his feet aching in the Italian shoes that suddenly felt more like a restraint than a status symbol. He made his way to the exit, but stopped when he saw Daniela still standing in the lobby, checking something on her tablet. She was alone for the first time all night, the mask of professionalism finally slipping to reveal weariness in her features. Lucas approached slowly, giving her time to walk away if she wished. But Daniela simply looked up, waiting for him to speak. "I just wanted to say," Lucas began, the words feeling inadequate before they even left his mouth, "that you were incredible tonight. The Boston Prosperity Initiative, the whole event, was extraordinary. You've built something truly important." "Thank you," Daniela replied, her voice carefully neutral, "and I'm sorry." The words tumbled out, laden with unfiltered emotion. "Not just for Larissa, or for tonight. I'm sorry for all the years I didn't truly see you, for all the times I made you feel invisible, for throwing away something precious because I was too arrogant to recognize what I had." Daniela studied his face for a long moment, and Lucas saw her defenses waver slightly. "I believe you're sorry, Lucas, but sorry isn't enough to undo years of neglect. I know, I just needed you to know. Now I know." Daniela picked up her purse, preparing to leave. "Take care of yourself, Lucas, truly. Figure out who you want to be and then become that person. But do it for yourself, not for me or for anyone else." She walked away. And this time Lucas didn't follow her. He simply stood in the empty lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel, surrounded by the remnants of an event that celebrated everything he was not, and finally allowed the tears he had been holding back all night to fall. The days following the gala dragged on in a thick fog of shame and forced introspection. Lucas had become Boston's main topic of conversation, his face plastered across tabloids and gossip blogs with cruel headlines ranging from "Tycoon betrayed by brilliant wife" to "The man who lost everything for a model." Every article was a fresh humiliation, every social media analysis a reminder of how completely he had become a cautionary tale. Crawford Enterprises was in freefall. Stocks had plummeted 23% in the first week after the scandal, and 3 major corporate clients had terminated contracts, citing concerns over leadership instability. The board had called an emergency meeting for next Monday, and Lucas knew they were preparing a vote of no confidence. Marcus had tried to stall them, but there was only so much even loyalty could do in the face of devastating financial figures. Lucas isolated himself in his Back Bay penthouse apartment, the same space that had once represented the pinnacle of his success. Now it felt like a mausoleum of glass and steel, filled with designer furniture that offered no comfort and expensive art that had no soul. He spent hours gazing out the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city pulse with life, while he existed in suspended animation. His lawyer Richard called daily with updates on the divorce proceedings, each conversation a catalogue of losses. The home he and Daniela had shared in Beacon Hill would be sold, with the profits divided. His investment portfolio was being meticulously dissected, each asset valued and distributed according to the terms Daniela had established. And true to her word, she was donating her half to charity with an efficiency that bordered on clinical. On the 4th morning after the gala, Lucas woke early at 5 a.m. after another night of fractured sleep. His apartment was too silent, the kind of silence that amplified thoughts instead of quieting them. He brewed coffee, watching the dawn paint the Boston sky with hues of pink and gold, and tried to remember the last time he had simply sat with his own thoughts without distraction. His phone vibrated with a news notification, a habit he had developed of obsessively checking to see what was being said about him. But this time, the story wasn't about him. It was about Daniela. A lengthy feature in the Boston Globe titled, "The Woman Behind the Boston Prosperity Initiative, How Daniela Crawford is Redefining Philanthropy." Lucas opened the article against his better judgment, unable to resist the compulsion to understand even more of what he had lost. The report traced Daniela's journey over the past 2 years, documenting how she had quietly built one of Boston's most innovative philanthropic organizations. There were interviews with people she had helped, teachers whose classrooms now had life-saving resources, families who had found shelter through her programs. But it was a quote near the end of the article that made Lucas stop completely. The reporter had asked Daniela about her public divorce, and she had responded with a grace that cut to the bone. Sometimes we lose sight of what truly matters when we're chasing versions of success that other people have defined for us. My marriage ended not because my husband was a bad man, but because we became fundamentally incompatible people. He measured value in accumulation. I measured it in impact. Neither of us was wrong, but we also couldn't be together anymore. Lucas read the quote repeatedly, searching for bitterness or hidden accusation. But there was none. Daniela had dismissed him not with anger, but with a clear, almost clinical analysis of their incompatibility. It was the kind of emotional maturity he had never possessed. The ability to see a situation from multiple perspectives without succumbing to guilt or victimhood. He had underestimated her so completely that it now seemed almost comical. All the years he thought he was in control, that he was the dominant partner in their marriage, Daniela had been cultivating depths he never bothered to explore. She had built relationships, developed skills, created a network of influence that rivaled his own, while he was busy patting himself on the back for his own importance. His apartment intercom rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. Lucas frowned, expecting no one. He rarely had visitors since the scandal, most of his social acquaintances having evaporated overnight. He pressed the intercom button with hesitation. Yes? Mr. Crawford. It's Andrew Fitzgerald from Leadership Perspectives. I know we don't have an appointment, but I'd like to talk with you, if you have a few minutes. Lucas vaguely recognized the name, a respected business publication that focused on ethical leadership and corporate responsibility. Part of him wanted to dismiss the man immediately, assuming he was just another journalist looking for sensational quotes to feed the news cycle. But something in Andrew's voice, a gentle tone of genuine interest rather than predatory curiosity, made Lucas hesitate. "Come up," he said finally, unlocking the apartment door and bracing himself for what would likely be another humiliating conversation. Andrew Fitzgerald was younger than Lucas expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with shaggy red hair and thick-rimmed glasses that gave him an academic air. He carried a worn leather backpack instead of a briefcase, and his clothes were casual yet professional, dark jeans and a navy blue sweater. "Thanks for having me," Andrew said as he entered, his eyes briefly scanning the luxurious apartment before returning to Lucas. "I'm sure you're tired of reporters, so I'll get straight to the point. I'm not here to write a scandal story. I'm working on a series about leaders who have faced public failures and how they rebuilt, or failed to rebuild, their lives and careers." Lucas gestured towards the sofa, grabbing 2 glasses of water from the kitchen before sitting in the armchair opposite him. "And you think I'm a good candidate for that? I think you're in the midst of something many leaders face, but few admit publicly. The moment your carefully constructed narrative collapses, and you're forced to confront who you really are versus who you thought you were." Andrew pulled a small recorder from his bag, holding it up. "May I record our conversation? And to be clear, you'll have final approval over any quotes I use. This isn't about further exposing you. It's about exploring the human journey through failure." Lucas looked at the recorder for a long moment. Every instinct he had cultivated over years of corporate negotiations screamed at him to refuse, to keep his cards close to his chest, not to admit weakness. But what sense did those instincts make now? His weakness was already on national display. Perhaps there was something liberating about simply being honest for the first time in years. "All right," Lucas said finally. "But if this turns into another sensationalist article, I'll never speak to a reporter again." "Fair enough." Andrew switched on the recorder and placed it on the coffee table between them. "So, let's start with a simple question. When you look back at the events of the past week, what do you see?" Lucas leaned back in his chair, carefully considering his answer. "I see a man who built his entire life around a version of success that turned out to be hollow. I chased wealth, power, recognition, assuming those things would bring me satisfaction. And when I started to feel empty despite having achieved all those milestones, I blamed my wife for not being exciting enough, for not making me feel alive. But it wasn't her fault. No, it wasn't. It was my failure to recognize that you cannot outsource your sense of purpose to someone else. You cannot expect a partner to fill voids that only you can fill. Lucas picked up his glass of water, more to have something to do with his hands than out of thirst. Daniela built a meaningful life alongside me, and I was so distracted pursuing external validation that I never noticed. Worse, I made her feel that her work didn't matter because it didn't generate the kind of financial returns I valued. Andrew wrote something in a small notebook, his thoughtful eyes behind his glasses. Do you think this is a common experience among business leaders? I think it's more common than anyone wants to admit. We build corporate cultures that celebrate ruthless ambition, that treat work-life balance as a weakness rather than a necessity. I prided myself on working 80 hours a week, on always being available for business, on sacrificing personal time for professional success. And I called it dedication when it was really just a sophisticated escape mechanism. Escape from what? The question was simple, but it cut straight to the heart of something Lucas had been avoiding examining too closely. He fell silent for a long moment, grappling with an honest answer. Escape from true vulnerability, he finally admitted. In business, I had control. I could make plans, execute strategies, see tangible results. But in relationships, you can't control another person. You can't force connection or intimacy through hard work or strategic thinking. You have to show up, be seen, risk rejection. And somewhere along the way, that became more terrifying to me than any high-stakes negotiation ever could be. Andrew leaned forward, clearly engaged. So how do you rebuild from here? The Crawford Enterprises board is threatening to remove you. You're facing a public divorce. Your personal reputation is in tatters. What's the next step? Lucas had thought about this obsessively over the past few days, circling between despair and failed attempts at strategic formulation. But now, speaking aloud, something crystallized in his mind. I think the next step is to stop trying to control the narrative, he said slowly. Stop trying to manipulate perception or craft some PR campaign to rehabilitate my image. I messed up. Publicly, devastatingly, in ways that hurt a person who didn't deserve it. And maybe instead of trying to minimize that or move on to the next thing, I need to simply sit with the consequences. That sounds like surrender. Maybe it is, or maybe it's the first honest move I've made in years. Lucas met Andrew's eyes, feeling something release in his chest. My entire adult life has been about building, conquering, accumulating. But you cannot build integrity the same way you build a business. You cannot conquer respect through force, and you definitely cannot accumulate meaningful connections without genuine reciprocity. Andrew turned off the recorder but remained seated, his body language suggesting the conversation had transcended the journalistic interview format. Can I tell you something off the record? Andrew asked. Lucas nodded. I was addicted to work 5 years ago. Not as extreme as your situation, but headed in that direction. My wife gave me an ultimatum. Get help, or she'd leave. And I got angry, defensive, all the classic patterns of denial. Andrew took off his glasses, cleaning them thoughtfully. But eventually I had to admit she was right. I was using work like a drug, avoiding uncomfortable feelings by keeping myself perpetually busy. Therapy helped, but you know what really changed things? Simply slowing down enough to feel the discomfort instead of running from it. And you think that's what I need to do. I think you're already doing it. This conversation, the way you're articulating your failures without excuses or self-pity, that's real work. Andrew put away his notebook, preparing to leave. But you need to understand it's going to get worse before it gets better. People will continue to judge you, your professional decisions will be questioned, and you'll have to rebuild trust bit by bit. There's no shortcut through it. After Andrew left, Lucas sat in silence in his apartment, feeling something fundamentally shift in his perspective. For days he had been waiting for some moment of clarity to arrive, some dramatic epiphany that would instantly reorder his understanding of everything. But the truth was more mundane and more profound than that. Change didn't happen in bright flashes. It happened in quiet admissions, in uncomfortable moments of vulnerability, in small, consistent choices to show up differently. He picked up his phone and opened his contacts, scrolling to a name he hadn't called in months. Dr. Patricia Ramos, a therapist Marcus had recommended years ago when Lucas casually mentioned feeling overwhelmed. He had never booked an appointment, convincing himself he was too fine, too busy, too successful to need therapy. Now, sitting in the ruins of everything he had built, Lucas finally dialed the number. Dr. Patricia Ramos's office was in a renovated Victorian building in Cambridge, far enough from Boston's financial district that Lucas could breathe without feeling the weight of judging gazes. The waiting room was small and inviting, with walls painted a soft green and plants that looked genuinely cared for, not just sterile corporate decor. Lucas arrived 15 minutes early for his first session, his hands sweating as he flipped through a magazine he wasn't really reading. When the inner door opened, Dr. Ramos emerged with a warm smile that immediately disarmed some of Lucas's tension. She was in her late 50s, with short graying hair and brown eyes that conveyed both intelligence and compassion. Her handshake was firm, her office an extension of the waiting room, comfortable without being oppressive. "Lucas, thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to an upholstered armchair as she sat in another opposite him, not behind a desk that would create unnecessary barriers. "I know taking this step can be difficult, especially considering what you're facing publicly." "Honestly, I don't know where to start," Lucas admitted, his voice carrying a vulnerability he rarely allowed others to hear. "How about we start with what brought you here today? Not the public story, but what you're feeling internally." Lucas took a deep breath, organizing thoughts that had been a chaotic whirlwind for weeks. "I feel as if I've woken up from a 15-year dream and discovered that the person I've become is someone I don't recognize. And worse, it's someone I'm not sure I even like." The following weeks unfolded at a pace that was simultaneously agonizingly slow and startlingly fast. Lucas began to see Dr. Ramos twice a week, sessions that were both exhaustive and strangely liberating. She guided him through introspection exercises that forced him to examine patterns he had repeated his entire adult life, defense mechanisms he had built to avoid true vulnerability. The Crawford Enterprises board meeting took place on a gray Monday, 3 weeks after the gala. Lucas entered the conference room expecting hostility, prepared to fight for his position. But instead, he found something more complex, a mix of concern and frustration on the faces of board members he had known for years. Marcus opened the meeting with a frank summary of the company's financial situation. Stock prices had stabilized somewhat after the initial plunge, but investor confidence remained fragile. 3 important contracts had been lost, but 2 new potential clients had expressed interest, intrigued by the possibility of renewed leadership. "The question before us isn't just financial," said Margaret Chen, the longest-serving board member and Marcus's aunt. "It's about whether Crawford Enterprises can recover under current leadership, given the circumstances." Lucas had rehearsed a defense, carefully constructed arguments about his professional competence versus his personal failings. But sitting in that room, looking at faces that represented not just corporate interests, but years of professional relationships, he realized that defenses were exactly the pattern he needed to break. "You are right to question my leadership," Lucas said, his voice steady, despite the fear clutching his chest. "I have demonstrated deeply flawed judgment, not just in my personal life, but in how I allowed personal issues to bleed into professional decisions. I used company resources inappropriately, let arrogance obscure sound strategy, and, most fundamentally, forgot that leadership isn't about dominion, but about serving something larger than oneself." The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. Lucas continued, feeling as if he were shedding layers of armor he had worn for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to exist without them. "I am not asking to keep my position because I think I deserve it. I am asking for the opportunity to demonstrate that I can lead differently, with humility and genuine purpose. But if you decide that the company needs new leadership, I will accept that decision and do everything in my power to ensure a smooth transition." The vote was postponed for 2 weeks, time for Lucas to demonstrate through actions, not words, that genuine change was possible. Marcus pulled him aside after the meeting, his expression cautiously hopeful. "That was courageous," Marcus said, "but you know courage alone won't save the company." "I know. That's why I need your help." Lucas met the eyes of his friend and partner, letting all his uncertainty show. "Teach me how to lead in a way that isn't about ego or control. Show me what I've been doing wrong all these years." Marcus considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right. But you have to be willing to truly listen, not just perform humility while waiting to slip back into old patterns." At home, Lucas began the difficult work of rebuilding not his public life, but his inner life. Dr. Ramos gave him exercises that seemed simplistic at first glance, but revealed complexity in their execution. Keeping a gratitude journal forced him to notice small things he had overlooked for years. Practicing mindful meditation revealed how rarely he was truly present in his own life, his mind constantly jumping to next tasks or ruminating on worries. He began to volunteer at one of the shelters that Daniela's Boston Prosperity Initiative supported, not for public relations, but because Dr. Ramos suggested that serving others without expectation of return could reorient his understanding of worth. The first few times were deeply uncomfortable, Lucas feeling exposed and useless without his corporate skills to hide behind. But gradually, as he served meals and spoke with people whose lives were so different from his own, something began to shift. A man named Raymond, a veteran in his 60s who had lost his home after a series of medical crises, shared stories about his life before homelessness. He had been a math teacher, a father of 3. Someone with dreams and plans that were derailed not by moral failing, but by circumstances beyond his control. "The hardest thing isn't losing your home," Raymond said one night as they organized donated blankets. "It's losing the sense that you matter, that your life has purpose beyond just surviving another day." The words hit Lucas with unexpected force. He had been so consumed by his own fall from a position of privilege that he hadn't truly considered what it meant to have never had that position to begin with. His crisis was about wounded ego and public humiliation. Raymond's was about basic human dignity and survival needs. "How do you keep hope?" Lucas asked, genuinely curious. Raymond smiled, an expression that carried sadness but also unexpected resilience. "You find small things to care about. A good meal, a decent conversation, the possibility that tomorrow might be a little better than today. And you try to be kind, because kindness is the only thing no one can take from you." Lucas left the shelter that night, with silent tears tracing paths down his face as he drove through the lit-up streets of Boston. He had spent his entire adult life chasing more, presuming that satisfaction was always just one achievement beyond. But Raymond, with literally nothing but a backpack of belongings and a bunk bed in a shelter, had articulated a philosophy of life more profound than any business book Lucas had ever read. The divorce proceedings progressed with surprising efficiency. Daniela wasn't interested in dragging things out, and Lucas, true to his word, didn't contest any of her terms. The house on Beacon Hill was listed and sold in 3 weeks to a young tech couple who fell in love with its original stained glass windows and marble fireplace. Lucas felt a pang watching new owners take possession of a space that had held 15 years of his life, but it was a clean sadness, without the bitterness he might have felt weeks earlier. He moved into a smaller apartment in Somerville, a neighborhood he would never have considered during his years of corporate ascent. There was no doorman or panoramic view, but there was a coffee shop on the corner where the baristas learned his name, and neighbors who waved in the hallways. The simplicity was initially unsettling, then strangely liberating. Marcus began to include Lucas in client meetings again, but with a twist. Instead of letting him lead as he once did, Marcus had him observe, learn, see how to build relationships based on mutual respect instead of strategic domination. Lucas watched Marcus genuinely listen to client concerns, admit when he didn't have immediate answers, prioritize long-term sustainable solutions over quick gains. "You were always brilliant at closing deals," Marcus said after a particularly successful meeting. But you treated every interaction like a battle to be won. People don't just want to do business with you. They want to trust you, to feel heard by you. In therapy, Dr. Ramos guided Lucas through painful explorations of his early family relationships, patterns established in childhood that he had replicated in his adult life without examination. His father had been a successful businessman who measured love in accomplishments, affection doled out based on performance. Lucas had spent his entire life trying to earn approval through ever greater achievements, never stopping to question if this was a game that could be won. "What did you truly want from your father?" Dr. Ramos asked during a session 6 weeks after their work together had begun. Lucas struggled with the question, layers of defenses resisting simple honesty. "I wanted him to see me, not my accomplishments, not my potential to bring glory to the family name. Just me." "And do you think Daniela saw you?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "She did. For all those years, even when I wasn't really looking at her, she saw me, and I wasted that." Tears came then, not the silent weeping he'd occasionally allowed since the gala, but deep bodily sobs that shook him with their intensity. Dr. Ramos simply sat with him through it, her steady presence as Lucas finally allowed himself to feel the full depth of his loss. The second board vote happened on an April afternoon when Boston was finally waking from its winter hibernation. Lucas had spent the intervening 2 weeks demonstrating new leadership, not through grand gestures but through consistent, small changes. He admitted mistakes openly. He genuinely asked for feedback and then actually incorporated it. He prioritized employee well-being over short-term quarterly results. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. Lucas would retain his position as CEO, but with increased board oversight, and Marcus serving as cooperational lead. It wasn't the uncontested dominion he once enjoyed, but it was an opportunity to rebuild differently. "Don't make me regret this," Margaret Chen said after the vote. But her eyes carried something that might have been cautious hope. That night, Lucas sat in his new, smaller apartment, surrounded by boxes he hadn't fully unpacked yet, and wrote a letter to Daniela. Not an email or text message, but an actual letter on paper, words carefully chosen with a pen. His hand wasn't used to holding for extended periods. He didn't ask for forgiveness, knowing he had no right to expect it. He didn't suggest reconciliation, understanding that chapter was permanently closed. Instead, he wrote gratitude. Gratitude for the years she supported him, for the ways she challenged him without his realizing it, for the grace with which she let him go. He acknowledged his own failings without dismissing her pain, and he thanked her for forcing him, through her dramatic exit, to finally confront who he had become. Lucas addressed the envelope and left it on his desk, uncertain if he would actually send it. But writing had been cathartic, a way to externalize thoughts that circulated endlessly inside his head. As spring turned into summer, Lucas established new rhythms. Therapy on Tuesdays and Thursdays, volunteering at the shelter on Saturday mornings, evening runs through his new neighborhood, not with headphones blocking out the world, but present to the sounds and observations around him. He began to cook actual meals instead of ordering takeout, finding there was something meditative in the process of preparing food just for himself. Raymond from the shelter eventually secured stable housing through one of the programs Daniela's initiative funded. On the day of his move, he embraced Lucas with a strength that conveyed years of struggle and newfound hope. "You're a good man," Raymond said. "Don't let your mistakes define you. Let what you do from them define you." Lucas carried those words with him. A reminder that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a different future, choice by choice. One August evening, walking home from therapy, Lucas passed a small art gallery with windows open to the street. Something in the exhibition drew him inside, abstract paintings that somehow captured emotions he was only just beginning to articulate. And there, standing,